About a year ago, we brought in our first Honolulu Pickleball paddle, the J2K, and it was an instant hit. Then they released their J2Ti, which was also very good. Now it's time to introduce the brand new J2K and J2Ti Plus. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So the J2K and the J2Ti were very successful paddles last year, and Honolulu Pickleball has decided to take them the Gen 3 route with their update for 2025. Obviously, Gen 3 paddles are very popular, although also a little bit controversial, as we've seen with the never-ending Ripple saga. But I have to say, having played with these over the last week or so, I don't think we're going to have the same issues. They both play and feel like Gen 3 paddles, but they don't push it to that level that I guess USAPA considers over the top, so I would imagine they're going to stay legal, although at this point, I don't even know what to think anymore. Now, we are going to get into the tech specs here, but before that, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So I am going to talk about both the J2K and the J2Ti Plus today because they are a little bit different, but overall play quite similarly, and other than the top sheets, everything else is pretty much the same. The real big update with these paddles compared to the standard J2K and J2Ti is that they're made from a Gen 3 construction, so they have a floating core, which, as you can imagine, changes pretty much everything about their feel and playability. They've got a wider layer of perimeter foam on the outside, and then a carbon ring separating that foam from the floating polypropylene core. Now, Honolulu Pickleball actually acknowledges in their marketing that because of this construction, these paddles are going to change over time, which obviously we've seen with a lot of the other Gen 3s. They talk about a break-in period where these paddles become slightly softer and more powerful, and then a normal operating period where they play their best, and then the breakdown period where their performance starts to decline a bit. It's pretty interesting to see a brand actually telling you that their paddles are going to wear out, but that is the reality here, and they actually do have a cool warranty program that unfortunately we can't yet confirm is going to be available in Canada. That is a little frustrating. Hopefully we can sort that out as soon as possible, and I will pin a comment below the description once we do have an answer to that. Now, apart from that Gen 3 design, everything else about the construction and the materials is the same. They've got the same top sheet, so a DuPont Kevlar weave on the J2K, and then a carbon fiber and PET electroplated fiber weave on the J2Ti, and of course they are still thermoformed. There have been a few tweaks in the specs. The J2K still has that same 16.2 inch, 16 millimeter thick hybrid shape, and it still weighs between 8 and 8.4 ounces, but the swing weight and the twist weight have gone up a bit. Target swing weight is now between 113 and 118, up from 113 flat, and the twist weight is now between 7.1 and 7.3, which is up from 7.05. And I actually think these are important changes, and I'll talk about why in the feel section later. It's a similar spec update on the J2Ti Plus. In fact, these paddles have virtually identical specs, except for the swing weight range, which for some reason is between 113 and 117 on the J2Ti Plus instead of 118. No idea why, but now let's talk about how these paddles actually play. So at its core, what a Gen 3 core design does, no pun intended, is that it increases dwell time. Obviously, a lot of brands have been able to massively increase power by working with that dwell time, but the real big thing is that the core moves around so the ball can sink into the paddle face a lot more. With both the J2K and the J2Ti Plus, that is extremely obvious right off the bat. The non-plus version of these paddles definitely still have that firmer Gen 2 feel to them. These are significantly softer. They have that really plush pocketing we now associate with floating cores. The difference with these two paddles compared to most of the other Gen 3s is that it feels like that dwell time cushions the ball a lot more rather than add a ton of spring effect. On the Yolas, the gearboxes, the Ripple, you get that long dwell time, but it comes with a trampoline effect that creates this really bouncy, springy sensation. I'm not saying that's completely gone here, but whatever trampoline effect you get from that core is way less obvious right out of the box. Now, I only used these for about 3 hours, so I didn't necessarily break them into that optimal point they're supposed to get to, but I actually really like that they're softer, and I'll talk about why in the control section, and I'll explain why it's not too big of a problem for power. But yes, the main thing with both these paddles is that they have a really plush, long dwell time that's completely different to their Gen 2 counterparts, and in my opinion, this is better when we're talking about feel and connection to the ball. Longer dwell time gives you that split second more to control the ball while it's in the paddle face and guide it where you want to put it. So while it is a matter of preference, some people will still prefer that stiffer feel, Objectively, I think this provides more feel for the ball. Now, I do have a slight issue with this much softer response, and I wasn't necessarily expecting that considering how other Gen 3 paddles play, but I do think stability is a little lacking here. The sweet spot is bigger because that plusher feel extends it farther along the paddle face, but because they're so soft, these paddles can get a little flimsy when you're not making perfect contact. It's almost like the ball sits in there for too long and loses some energy to the point where it kind of dies in the paddle face, I guess you could say. And compared to the Gen 3 paddles that have more trampoline effect, those paddles are so springy that you never get that feeling at all. That was just a small observation I had, that slight lack of stability, and I actually think that's why they've increased the twist weight and the swing weight compared to the standard version of these paddles. Obviously, stiffer paddles don't feel quite as premium outside of the sweet spot, so they technically have smaller sweet spots, but they're also firmer, so they feel more stable on off-center hits. That increase in weight just counterbalances that slight lack of stability, but that does bring me nicely to my next point, which is that I do think there is a small difference in terms of stability between these two. Titanium has always had a more metallic feel than Kevlar, and I actually think in this case it makes the dwell time shorter because that metallic element kicks in and firms up that point of contact. Now, I'm really splitting hairs here. These paddles feel very similar, but in terms of stock stability without any extra customization, the J2Ti is just a little level above the J2K, although that's something I feel could change with break-in. The J2K Plus has slightly longer dwell time, so I feel like it could become more powerful with more spring effect after break-in, which would essentially help in increasing stability like I said it does on other Gen 3s. That's a little bit of guesswork though. The reality is I don't know exactly what's going to happen to these paddles as they break in, so I will try to make an update video in the future. But now let's talk about how this unique feel translates to power, spin, and control. Essentially, the longer dwell time you get from a floating core can help with power, spin, and control. For control, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. You have more time to feel the ball and guide it where you want. Obviously, guiding the ball is extremely important in pickleball because of how precise we need to be dropping it into the kitchen. But Gen 3 paddles haven't always been considered elite for control, and that's because of their spring effect. Spring effect makes control harder because it adds power and depth to your ball, so you have that longer dwell time, but with a certain risk attached to it. Like I said, these don't have nearly as much trampoline effect as some other Gen 3s, which eliminates a lot of that difficulty factor, so these are really, really good for control. I personally love the control on the standard J2K and J2Ti, but this is on a whole different level. That plush, soft dwell time gives you so much more time to feel the ball while it's in the paddle face, which makes dinking in particular so easy. The J2Ti is a tiny bit more metallic and muted, but still super soft, so pretty much on the same level as the J2K up there. Where there's a bigger difference between these two paddles is in the control game away from the kitchen. Because the J2Ti is more stable, especially on off-center hits, I was actually a little bit more confident using it for drops and resets in those more random situations. The J2K, I really think, either needs more break-in time or potentially actually a little bit more weight, because there were a few times where I just felt like I lost total control over the amount of depth I was putting on the ball. That soft feel can be a bit of a double-edged sword. It can become a little mushy, which leaves me disconnected from the ball, and there were times where I wanted the paddle to feel a bit more solid. So I think the J2Ti is a little bit better for control, at least in stock form and before break-in. I'm also kind of getting annoyed with this whole break-in thing. I mean, I feel like I shouldn't have to play with a paddle for X amount of hours before it plays the way it should. How am I supposed to explain that change in playability to someone? I can't just say after 10 hours it's going to play like this. What if I hit harder than you? What if I hit softer than you? That's going to change the amount of time it takes. But I will try to update you all in the future on that change in playability over time. But yeah, the J2Ti Plus is slightly better for control. It's just a little bit more consistent. I was going back and forth between these two, but I was definitely defaulting to this one when points got tight and I needed to be super confident in my paddle. Now, if soft control is easier here than on some other Gen 3 paddles, does that also mean they're not as powerful? Yes, that's exactly what that means. These paddles are not as powerful out of the box as the Yolas, the Gearboxes, and the Ripple. That could change over time since these are supposed to get more powerful, but those also get more powerful, so that gap is probably just going to stay similar. Now, there is still a bit of that trampoline effect here, so you still get more power and pop than on Gen 2 paddles. It's just exactly what you would expect in terms of how increasing control usually means sacrificing power. Pop is still excellent up at the net. You get plenty of depth and velocity on serves and on your ground strokes, so power is in no way lacking. It's just not off the charts like it is on those other paddles, and yeah, to be honest, that might be a good thing. I don't see these becoming too hot at any point. They're just not powerful enough. with those paddles that have gone through that legality limbo, you could definitely tell right away that something was very different about them. These don't have that same effect. Between the two, you definitely get more of that depth and velocity, at least when you're swinging big on the J2K Plus. It consistently launches the ball farther on serve, and I was playing skinny singles, so I didn't hit that many big ground strokes, but when I did, it definitely had a bit more zing to it. Things are closer between the two in terms of pop at the net, but I'd still say the J2K has it beat. Just feels like you get more of that trampoline effect on this paddle, but because volleys require a more compact stroke, you don't get as much of it, so the difference is less obvious. Hopefully that makes sense. I know it might be a little bit confusing, and to be honest, these paddles are very similar. Those differences are marginal at best. Maybe they'll become bigger over time as they break in, but yeah, these paddles are both powerful, just not quite on the same level as some other Gen 3s. I've saved the best for last. Obviously, spin is another area where Gen 3s are absolutely elite because when you combine a long dwell time, a trampoline effect, and a super gritty top sheet, you get this magical sensation of extreme purchase over the ball. Spin is absolutely fantastic on both of these, and this is one area where I couldn't pick out any difference between the two. In fact, I'll go ahead and say it. I think they are identical in terms of spin potential. I'm going to start with top end spin, so the spin you're looking for when you're swinging big on drives and serves. These are almost as high as the most spin-friendly Gen 3s like the Rhombus Ripple and the Yolas, but a slight notch under because they have less trampoline effect. You still benefit from that dwell time to shape the ball, but part of the magic with extra trampoline effect is that it almost feels like strings in a tennis racket that amplifies spin onto the ball. Again, there is still some trampoline effect, but just not as much, so less top end spin, but because they're less powerful, you don't need as much spin to control them. Where these are a notch ahead of those ultra powerful Gen 3s is in the soft spin game. Because they don't send the ball as far, you don't have to hold back as much on soft spin shots because you're worried about overhitting. You can really brush up on the ball with a ton of paddle head speed and let that dwell time and grit do the work for you. So you can hit some brutal low dipping passing shots or touch spin shots that are super hard to pick up. You also have to remember that these are hybrid paddles, so they're quite a bit shorter than 16.5 inch Gen 3s, so it's easier to generate that windshield wiper motion, which you need especially for soft spin. Now that shorter shape does mean less leverage, which is part of the reason why they have less top end spin, but that's just a normal trade-off. And because these are a little bit more finesse and touch oriented, I think it's for the better. These are great paddles. I think I've made that quite obvious, and I actually think they fill a gap in the market that really needed to be filled. Up until now, I've been very hesitant to recommend Gen 3s to anyone that isn't at least a 4.0 level player. That's because they're so springy and so difficult to use that unless you really know what you're doing, you're probably going to use them wrong and end up playing worse pickleball just trying to bash the ball the whole time. These are Gen 3s for sure. They have that typical floating core feel, but they're less uncontrollably powerful, so you can benefit from those Gen 3 characteristics without all the risks. They are way easier to control, so they make the touch game, which is really the important part of pickleball, a lot easier, and they're hybrid paddles, so they're more maneuverable and much quicker to react with at the net. Power isn't quite on the level of some other Gen 3s, but still higher than most paddles, so if you've never tried a Gen 3, you'll be more than happy, and if we are to believe Honolulu Pickleball, they are going to get hotter over time. The good news is, I don't think power will ever get to stratospheric levels, so we shouldn't have to worry too much about delisting, but again, I will update you on that in the future. Between these two, go for the J2Ti Plus if you want a little bit more consistent control and also a tiny bit less top end power, and also probably a little bit less high power potential in the future. Go for the J2K Plus if you want exactly that. More power, a little bit less control, and with this one, I would recommend adding some weight to the sides to increase that stability. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo either of these two paddles, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.